Good evening. I'm Canned Official, and welcome to Stephen King's Wastelands Part 4. We're going to be reading through The Wastelands by Stephen King. And this is going to cover Book 2, Blood, A Heap of Broken Images, Chapter 4, Town in Ka-Tet. As of right now, I am only joined with myself, but people might drop in. Who knows? I'm gonna try this. 4. Town in Ka-Tet. 1. 4 days after Eddie had yanked him through the doorway between worlds, minus his original pair of pants and his sneakers, but still in possession of his pack and his life, Jake awoke with something warm and wet nuzzling at his face. If he had come around to such a sensation on any of the 3 previous mornings, he undoubtedly would have wakened his companions with his screams. For he had been feverish, and his sleep had been haunted by nightmares of the Plaster Man. And I lost my space. There it is, Plaster Man. In these dreams, his pants did not slide free. The doorkeeper kept his grip, and it tucked him into its unspeakable mouth, where its teeth came down like the bars guarding a castle keep. Jake awoke from these dreams, shuddering and moaning helplessly. Let me turn this off. The fever had been caused by the spider bite on the back of his neck. When Roland examined it on the second day and found it worse instead of better, he had conferred briefly with Eddie and had been then given Jake a pink pill. "You want to take 4 of these every day for at least a week," he said. Oh, sorry. Jake had gazed at it doubtfully. "What is it?" "Cheflet," Roland said, then looked disgustedly at Eddie. "You tell him. I still can't say it." "K-Flex. You can trust it, Jake. It came from a government-approved pharmacy in good old New York. New York. Roland swallowed a bunch of it, and he's as healthy as a horse. Looks a little like one, too, as you can see." Jake was astonished. "How did you get medicine in New York?" "That's a long story," Gunslinger said. "You'll hear all of it in time, but for now, just take the pill." Jake did. The response was both quick and satisfying. The angry red swelling around the bite began to fade in 24 hours. And now the fever was gone as well. The warm thing nuzzled again, and Jake sat up with a jerk, his eyes flying open. The creature which had been licking his cheek took 2 hasty steps backward. It was a billy bumbler, but Jake didn't know that. He had never seen one before now. It was skinnier than the ones Roland's party had seen earlier, and its black and gray striped fur was matted and mangy. There was a clot of old dried blood on one flank. Its gold-ringed black eyes looked at Jake anxiously. Its hindquarters switched hopefully back and forth. Jake relaxed. He supposed there were exceptions to the rule, but he had an idea that something wagging its tail, or trying to, was probably not too dangerous. It was just past first light, probably around 5:30 in the morning. Jake could peg it no closer than that because his digital psycho no longer worked. Or rather, was working in an extremely eccentric way. When he had first glanced at it after coming through, the Seiko claimed it was 98:71:65 seconds, a time which did not, so far as Jake knew, exist. A longer look showed him that the watch was now running backward. If it had been doing this at a steady rate, He supposed it might still have been of some use, but it wasn't. It would unwind its numbers at what seemed like the right speed for a while. Jake verified this by saying the word Mississippi between each number, and then the readout would either stop entirely for 10 or 20 seconds, making him think the watch had finally given up the ghost, or a bunch of numbers would blur by all at once. He had mentioned this odd behavior to Roland and had shown him the watch, thinking it would amaze him, but Roland examined it closely for only a moment or two before nodding in a dismissive way and telling Jake it was an interesting clock. But as a rule, no timepiece did very good work these days, so the Seiko was useless. But Jake still found himself loath to throw it away, because, he supposed, it was a piece of his old life, and there were only a few of those left. Right now, Seiko claimed it was 62 minutes past 40 on a Wednesday, Thursday, and Saturday in both December and March. The morning was extremely foggy, beyond a radius of 50 or 60 feet. The world simply disappeared. If this day was like the previous 3, the sun would show up as a faint white circle in another 2 hours or so, and by 9:30, the day would be clear and hot. Jake looked around and saw his traveling companions, he didn't quite dare call them friends, at least not yet, asleep beneath their hide blankets. Roland close by, Eddie and Susanna a larger hump on the far side of the dead campfire. He once more turned his attention to the animal which had awakened him. It looked like a combination raccoon and woodchuck, with a dash of dachshund thrown in for good measure. "How you doing, boy?" he asked softly. "Oi!" the Billy Bumbler replied at once, still looking at him anxiously. Its voice was low and deep, almost a bark. The voice of an English footballer with a bad cold in his throat. Jake recoiled, surprised. The Billy Bumbler, startled by the quick movement, took several further steps backward, seemed about to flee, and then held its ground. Its hindquarters wagged back and forth more strenuously than ever, and its gold-black eyes continued to regard Jake nervously. The whiskers on its snout trembled. "This one remembers men," the voice remarked at Jake's shoulder. He looked around and saw Roland squatting just behind him with his forearms resting on his thighs, and his long hands dangling between his knees. He was looking at the animal with a great deal more interest than he had shown in Jake's watch. "What is it?" Jake asked softly. He did not want to startle it away. He was enchanted. "Its eyes are beautiful." "Billy Bumbler," Roland said. "Umber," the creature ejaculated and retreated another step. "It talks." "Not really. Bumblers just repeat what they hear, or used to. I haven't heard one do it in years. This fellow looks almost starved. Probably came to forage." "He was licking my face. Can I feed it?" "We'll never get rid of it if you do," Roland said, then smiled a little and snapped his fingers. "Hey, Billy!" The creature mimicked the sound of the snapping fingers somehow. It sounded as if it were clicking its tongue against the roof of its mouth. "Hey!" it called in its hoarse voice. "Hey, Illy!" Now its ragged hindquarters were positively flagging back and forth. "Go ahead and give it a bite. I knew an old groom once who said a good bumbler is good luck. This looks like a good one." "Yes, it does." Once they were tame, and every barony had half a dozen roaming around the castle or manor house. They weren't good for much except amusing the children and keeping the rat population down. They can be quite faithful, or were in the old days, although I never heard of one that would remain as loyal as a good dog. The wild ones are scavengers, not dangerous, but a pain in the ass. "Ass!" cried the Bumbler. Its anxious eyes continued to flick back and forth between Jake and the gunslinger. Jake reached into his pack, slowly, afraid to startle the creature, and drew out the remains of a gunslinger burrito. He tossed it toward the Billy Bumbler. The Bumbler flinched back and then turned with a small, childlike cry, exposing its furry corkscrew tail. Jake felt sure it would run, but it stopped, looking doubtfully back over its shoulder. "Come on," Jake said. "Eat it, boy." "Oi!" the Bumbler muttered, but it didn't move. "Give it time," Roland said. "It'll come, I think." The Bumbler stretched forward, revealing a long and surprisingly graceful neck. Its slender black nose twitched as it sniffed the food. At last it trotted forward, and Jake noticed it was limping a little. The Bumbler sniffed the burrito, then used one paw to separate the chunk of deer meat from the leaf. It carried out this operation with a delicacy that was oddly solemn. Once the meat was clear of the leaf, the Bumbler wolfed it in a single bite, then looked up at Jake. "Oi!" it said, and when Jake laughed, it shrank away again. "That's a skinny one," Eddie said sleepily from behind them. At the sound of his voice, the Bumbler immediately turned and was gone into the mist. "You scared it away." "Geez, I'm sorry," Eddie said. He ran a hand through his sleek, corkscrewed hair. "If I'd known it was one of your close personal friends, Jake, I would have dragged out the goddamn coffee cake." Roland clapped Jake briefly on the shoulder. "It'll be back." "Are you sure?" "If something doesn't kill it, yes. We fed it, didn't we?" Before Jake could reply, the sound of the drums began again. This was the third morning they had heard them, and twice the sound had come to them this afternoon, slipped down toward evening, a faint, toneless thudding from the direction of the city. The sound was clearer this morning, if no more comprehensible. Jake hated it. It was as if somewhere out in that thick and featureless blanket of morning mist, the heart of some big animal was beating. "You still don't have any idea what that is, Roland?" Susanna asked. She had slipped on her shift, tied back her hair, and was now folding the blankets beneath which she and Eddie had slept. "No, but I'm sure we'll find out." "How reassuring," Eddie said. Eddie said sourly. Roland got to his feet. "Come on, let's not waste the day." 2. The fog began to unravel after they had been on the road for an hour or so. They took turns pushing Susanna's chair, and it jolted unhappily along, for the road was now mined with large, rough cobblestones. "I love you too. Good night, babe." By mid-morning, the day was fair, hot, and cloudless. The city skyline stood out clearly on the southeastern horizon. To Jake, it didn't look like much different from the skyline of New York, although he thought these buildings might not be as high. If the place had fallen apart, as most things in Roland's world apparently had, certainly couldn't tell it from here. Like Eddie, Jake had begun to entertain the unspoken hope that they might find help there, or at least a good hot meal. To their left, 30 or 40 miles away, they could see the broad sweep of the Send River. Birds circled above it in large flocks. Every now and then one would fold its wings and drop like a stone, probably on a fishing expedition. The road and the river were moving slowly toward one another, although the junction point could not yet be seen. They could see more buildings ahead. Most looked like farms, and all appeared deserted. Some of them had fallen down, but these wrecks seemed to be the work of time rather than violence. Furthering Eddie's and Jake's hopes of what they might find in the city, hopes each had kept strictly within himself, lest the others scoff. Small herds of shaggy beasts grazed their way across the plains. They kept well away from the road except to cross, and this they did quickly, at a gallop, like packs of small children afraid of traffic. They looked like bison to Jake. except he saw several which had two heads. He mentioned this to the gunslinger, and Roland nodded. Beauties. Like under the mountains? Jake heard the fear in his own voice and knew the gunslinger must also, but he was helpless to keep it out. He remembered what endless nightmare journey on that handcart very well. He remembered that endless nightmare journey on the handcart very well. I think that here the mutant strains are being bred out. The things we found under the mountains were still getting worse. What about up there? Jake pointed toward the city. Will there be mutants there, or... He found it was as close as he could come to voicing his hope. Roland shrugged. I don't know, Jake. I'd tell you if I did. They were passing an empty building, almost surely a farmhouse, that had been partially burnt. But that could have been lightning, Jake thought, and wondered which it was he was trying to do, explain to himself or fool himself. Roland, perhaps reading his mind, put an arm around Jake's shoulders. No use even trying to guess, Jake. Whatever happened here happened long ago. He pointed. That over there was probably a corral. Now it's just a few sticks poking out of the grass. The world has moved on, right? Roland nodded. What about the people? Did they go to the city, do you think? Some may have. Some are still around. What? Susanna jerked around to look at him, startled. Roland nodded. We've been watched the last couple of days. There aren't a lot of folk denning in these old buildings, but there are some. There'll be more as we get closer to civilization. Or what used to be civilization. How do you know they're there? Jake asked. Smelled them. Seen a few gardens hidden behind banks of weeds grown purposely to hide the crops. And at least one working windmill way back in a grove of trees. Mostly, though, it's just a feeling. Like shade on your face instead of sunshine. It'll come to you three, in time, I imagine. Do you think they're dangerous? Susanna asked. They were approaching a large, ramshackle building that might once have been a storage shed or an abandoned country market, and she eyed it uneasily, her hand dropping to the butt of the gun she wore on her chest. Will a strange dog bite? What's that mean? I hate it when you start up with your Zen Buddhist shit. Zen Buddhist shit, Roland. Means I don't know. Who is this man Zen Buddhist? Is he wise like me? Eddie looked at Roland for a long, long time before deciding the gunslinger was making one of his rare jokes. Get out of here, he said. He saw one corner of Roland's mouth twitch before he turned away. As Eddie started to push Susanna's chair again, something else caught his eye. Hey, Jake, he called. I think you made a friend. Jake looked around and a big grin overspread his face. 40 yards to the rear, the scrawny Billy Bumbler was limping industriously after them, sniffing at the weeds which grew between the crumbling cobbles of the great road. It's about to get juicy, y'all. Three. Some hours later, Roland called a halt and told them to be ready. For what? Eddie asked. Roland glanced at him. Anything. It was perhaps 3 o'clock in the afternoon. They were standing at a point where the great road crested a long, rolling drumlin, which ran diagonally across the plain like a wrinkle in the world's biggest bedspread. Below and beyond, the road ran through the first real town they had seen. It looked deserted, but Eddie had not forgotten the conversation that morning. Roland's question, will a strange dog bite? no longer seemed quite so zenny. Jake! What? Eddie nodded to the butt of the Ruger, which protruded from the waistband of Jake's blue jeans, the extra pair he had tucked into his pack before leaving home. Do you want me to carry that? Jake glanced at Roland. The gunslinger only shrugged, as if to say, It's your choice. Okay. Jake handed it over. He unshouldered his pack, rummaged through it, and brought out the loaded clip. Okay. Sorry, I had a test. Where am I at? He unshouldered his pack, rummaged through it, and brought out the loaded clip. He could remember reaching behind the hanging flies in one of his father's desk drawers, files in one of his father's desk drawers to get it, but all that seemed to have occurred a long, long time ago. These days, thinking about his life in New York and his career as a student at Piper was like looking into the wrong end of a telescope. Eddie took the clip, examined it, rammed it home, checked the safety, and stuck the Ruger in his own belt. Listen closely and heed me well. If there are people, they'll likely be old and much more frightened of us than we are of them. The younger folk will be long gone. It's unlikely that those left will have firearms. In fact, ours may be the first guns many of them have ever seen, except maybe for a picture or two in the old books. Make no threatening gestures, and the childhood rule is a good one. Speak only when spoken to. What about bows and arrows? Yes, they may have those. Spears and clubs as well. Don't forget rocks, Eddie said bleakly, looking down at the cluster of wooden buildings. The place looked like a ghost town, but who knew for sure? And if they're hard up for rocks, there's always the cobbles from the road. Yes, there's always something. But we'll start no trouble ourselves, is that clear? They all nodded. Maybe it would be easier to detour around, Susanna said. Roland nodded, eyes never leaving the simple geography ahead. Another road had crossed the great road at the center of the town, making the dilapidated buildings look like a target centered in the telescopic sight of a high-powered rifle. It would, but we won't. Detouring's a bad habit that's easy to get into. It's always better to go straight on, unless there's a good, visible reason not to. I see no reason not to here, and if there are people, well, that might be a good thing. We could do with a little palaver. Susanna reflected that Roland seemed different now, and she didn't think it was simply because the voices in his mind had ceased. Just a second. Oh, dang. This is the way he was when he still had wars to fight and men to lead and his old friends around him, Susanna thought. How he was before the world moved on, and he moved on with it, chasing that man Walter. This is how he was before the big empty turned him inward on himself and made him strange. They might know what those drum sounds are, Jake suggested. Can't speak? Roland nodded again. Anything they know, particularly about the city, would come in handy, but there's no need to think ahead too much about people who may not even be there. Tell you what, Susanna said. I wouldn't come out if I saw us. 4 people, 3 of them armed. We probably look like a gang of those old-time outlaws in your stories, Roland. What do you call them? Harriers. His left hand dropped to the sandalwood grip of his remaining revolver, and he pulled it a little way out of the holster. But no Harrier ever born carried one of these. And if there are old-timers in yon village, they'll know it. Let's go. Jake glanced behind them and saw the bumbler lying in the road with his muzzle between his short front paws, watching them closely. Oi! Jake called. Oi! The bumbler echoed, and scrambled to its feet at once. They started down the shallow knoll toward the town, with Oi trotting along behind them. 4. 2 buildings on the outskirts had been burned. The rest of the town appeared dusty but intact. They passed on an abandoned livery stable on the left, a building that might have been a market on the right, and then they were in the town proper, such as it was. There were perhaps a dozen rickety buildings standing on either side of the road. Alleys ran between some of them. The other road, this one a dirt track mostly overgrown with plains grass, ran northeast to southwest. Susanna looked at its northeast arm and thought, once there were barges on the river, and somewhere down that road there was a landing, and probably another shacky little town. Mostly saloons and cribs built up around it. That was the last point of trade before the barges went on down to the city. The wagons came through this place, going to that place, and then back again. How long ago was that? She didn't know, but a long time from the look of this place. Somewhere a rusty hinge squalled monotonously. Somewhere else one shutter clapped lonesomely, to and fro in the plains wind. There were hitching rails, most of them broken, in front of the buildings. Once there had been board sidewalks, but now most of the boards were gone, and grass grew up through the holes where they had been. The signs on the buildings were faded, but some were still readable, written in a bastardized form of English, which was, she supposed, what Roland called the low speech. Food and grain, one said, and she guessed that might mean feed and grain. On the false front, next to it, below a crude drawing of a plains buffalo lying in the grass, were the words, rest, eat, drink. Under the sign, bat-wing doors hung crookedly, moving a little in the wind. Is that a saloon? She didn't know exactly why she was whispering. Oh, shit. Is that a saloon? Only that she couldn't have spoken in a normal tone of voice. It would have been like playing Clinch Mountain Breakdown on the banjo at a funeral. It was, Roland said. He didn't whisper, but his voice was low-pitched and thoughtful. Jake was walking close by his side, looking around nervously. Behind them, Oi had closed up his distance to 10 yards. He trotted quickly, head swinging from side to side, like a pendulum as he examined the buildings. Now Susanna began to feel it, that sensation of being watched. It was exactly as Roland had said it would be. A feeling sunshine had been replaced by shade. There are people, aren't there? She whispered. Roland nodded. Standing on the northeast corner of the crossroads was a building with another sign she recognized. Hostel, it said, and cots. Except for a church with a tilted steeple up ahead, it was the tallest building in town, 3 stories. She glanced up in time to see a white blur, surely a face, draw away from one of the glassless windows. Suddenly, she wanted to get out of here. Roland was setting a slow, deliberate pace, however, and she supposed she knew why. Hurrying might give the watchers the impression that they were scared, and that they could be taken. All the same. At the crossroads, the intersecting streets widened out, creating a town square which had been overrun by grass and weeds. In the center was an eroded stone marker. Above it, a metal box hung on a sagging length of rusty cable. Roland, with Jake by his side, walked toward the marker. Eddie pushed Susanna's chair after. Grass whispered in its spokes, and the wind tickled a lock of hair against her cheek. Further along the street, the shutter banged and the hinge squealed. She shivered and brushed the hair away. "I wish he'd hurry up," Eddie said in a low voice. "This place gives me the creeps." Susanna nodded. He looked around the square, and again, you could almost see how it must have been on market day. The sidewalks thronged with people, a few of them town ladies with their baskets over their arms, most of them wagoners and roughly dressed bargemen. She did not know why she was so sure of the barges and bargemen, but she was. The wagons passing through the town square, the ones on the unpaved road raising choking clouds of yellow dust as the drivers flogged their cart horses. Oxen. They were oxen. Along, she could see those carts, dusty swatches of canvas tied down over bales of cloth on some, and pyramids of tarred barrels on others. Could see the oxen, double-yoked and straining patiently, flicking their ears at the flies buzzing around their huge heads. Could hear voices and laughter, and the piano in the saloon pounding out a lively tune like Buffalo Gals or Darlin' Katie. "It's as if I've lived here in another life," she thought. The gunslinger bent over the inscription on the marker. "Great Road. Lud. 160 wheels." Wheels? An old form of measurement. Have you heard of Lud? Perhaps. When I was very small. It rhymes with crud. Maybe not such a good sign. Jake was examining the east side of the stone. River Road. It's written funny, but that's what it says. Eddie looked at the west side of the marker. It says Jimtown. 40 wheels. Isn't that the birthplace of Wayne Newton, Roland? Roland looked at him blankly. Shut my mouth, Eddie said and rolled his eyes. On the southwest corner of the square was the town's only stone building, a squat, dusty cube with rusty bars on the windows. Combination country drill and courthouse, Susanna thought. She had seen similar ones down south. Add a few slant parking spaces in front and you wouldn't be able to tell the difference. Something had been daubed across the facade of the building. Facade of the building in fading yellow paint. She could read it, and although she couldn't understand it, it made her more anxious than ever to get out of this town. Cubes die, it said. Roland! When she had his attention, she pointed at the graffito. What does that mean? He read it, then shook his head. Don't know. He looked around again. The square now seemed smaller, and the buildings seemed to be leaning over them. Can we get out of here? Soon. He bent down and pried a small chunk of cobble out of the roadbed. He bounced it thoughtfully in his left hand as he looked up at the metal box which hung over the marker. He cocked his arm, and Susanna realized an instant too late what he meant to do. No, Roland! She cried, then cringed back at the sound of her own horrified voice. He took no notice of her, but fired the stone upward. His aim was as true as ever, and it struck the box dead center with a hollow, metallic bang. There was a whir of clockwork from within, and a rusty green flag unfolded from a slot on the side. When it locked in place, a bell rang briskly. Written in large black letters on the side of the flag was the word Go. I'll be damned, Eddie said. It's a Keystone Cops traffic light. If you hit it again, does it say stop? Does it say stop? We have company, Roland said quietly, and pointed toward the building Susanna thought of as the country courthouse. A man and a woman had emerged from it and were descending the stone steps. You win the Cupid doll, Roland, Susanna thought. They're older and guyed, the both of them. The man was wearing bib overalls and a huge straw sombrero. The woman walked with one hand clamped on his naked sunburned shoulder. She wore homespun and a poke bonnet, and as they drew closer to the marker, Susanna saw she was blind, and that the accident which had taken her sight must have been exceedingly horrible. Where her eyes had been, there were now only two shallow sockets, filled with scar tissue. She looked both terrified and confused. "Be they Harriers, Si?" she cried in a cracked, quavering voice. "You'll have us killed yet, I'll warrant." "Shut up, Mercy," he replied like the woman. He spoke with a thick accent Susanna could barely understand. "They ain't Harriers, not these. There's a pube with them. I told you that. Ain't no Harrier ever been traveling with a pube." Blind or not, she tried to pull away from them. He cursed and caught her arm. "Quit it, Mercy! Quit it, I say! You'll fall down and do yourself evil, damn it!" "We mean you no harm," the gunslinger called. He used the high speech, and at the sound of it, the man's eyes lit up with incredulity. The woman turned back, swinging her blind face in their direction. "The gunslinger!" the man cried, his voice cracked and wavered with excitement. "'Fore God, I knew it were! I knew!" He began to run across the square toward them, pulling the woman after. She stumbled along helplessly, and Susanna waited for the inevitable moment when she must fall. But the man fell first, going heavily to his knees, and she sprawled painfully beside him on the cobbles of the great road. 5. Jake felt something furry against his ankle and looked down. The boy was crouched beside him, looking more anxious than ever. Jake reached down and cautiously stroked his head, as much to receive comfort as to give it. Its fur was silky, incredibly soft. For a moment he thought the bundler was going to run, but it only looked up at him, licked his hand, and then looked back at the two new people. The man was trying to help the woman to her feet and not succeeding very well. Her head craned this way and that in avid confusion. The man named Si had cut his palms on the cobblestones, but he took no notice. He gave up trying to help the woman, swept off his sombrero, and held it over his chest. To Jake, the hat looked as big as a bushel basket. We bid you welcome, gunslinger," he cried. "Welcome indeed. I thought all your kind had perished from the earth, so I did." "I thank you for your welcome," Roland said in the high speech. He put his hands gently on the blind woman's upper arms. She cringed for a moment, then relaxed and allowed him to help her up. "Put on your hat, old-timer. The sun is hot." He did, then just stood there, looking at Roland with shining eyes. After a moment or two, Jake realized what that shine was. Si was crying. "A gunslinger! I told you, Mercy! I seen the shooting iron and I told you!" "No Harriers?" she asked. I'm sorry that their voices are similar. "No Harriers?" she asked, as if unable to believe it. "Are you sure they ain't Harriers, Si?" Roland turned to Eddie. "Make sure of the safety and then give her Jake's gun." Eddie pulled the Ruger from his waistband, checked the safety, and then put it gingerly in the blind woman's hands. She gasped, almost dropped it, then ran her hands over it wonderingly. She turned the empty sockets where her eyes had been up to the man. "A gun," she whispered. "My sainted hat." "Ah, some kind," the old man replied dismissively, taking it from her and giving it back to Eddie. "But the gunslinger's got a real one, and there's a woman got another. She's got a brown skin too, like my dad said the people of Garland had." Boy gave his shrill whistling bark. Jake turned and saw more people coming up the street. 5 or 6 in all. Like Cy and Mercy, they were all old, and one of them, a woman hobbling over a cane like a witch in a fairy tale, looked positively ancient. As they neared, Jake realized that 2 of the men were identical twins. Long white hair spilled over the shoulders of their patched homespun shirts. Their skin was as white as fine linen. Thanks, bud. Appreciates it. Welcome. Their skin was as white as fine linen, and their eyes were pink. Albinos, he thought. The crone appeared to be their leader. She hobbled toward Roland's party on her cane, staring at them with gimlet eyes as green as emeralds. Her toothless mouth was tucked deeply into itself. The hem of the old shawl she wore fluttered in the prairie breeze. Her eyes settled upon Roland. "Hail, gunslinger! Well met!" she spoke. Damn it, I need to find my voices. For real. Because that's 3. I had, welcome in. Yes. Sneak, you joining me tonight? Because some of these voices need help. Hail, gunslinger, well met. She spoke the high speech herself, and like Eddie and Susanna, Jake understood the words perfectly, although he guessed they would have been gibberish to him in his own world. Welcome to River Crossings. The gunslinger had removed his own hat, and now he bowed to her, tapping his throat 3 times, rapidly, with his diminished right hand. Thank you, Cy, old mother. She cackled freely at this, and Eddie suddenly realized Roland had at the same time made a joke and paid a compliment.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you now. Evening, bud. The thought which had already occurred to Susanna now came to him. I'll restart that
Picture
paragraph.
this lady is like the oldest lady in the universe.
So she needs to be like, okay.
She's very old.
She's the oldest one of everyone. Wavering voice and all. Okay, gotcha.
Hold on, what page are you on?
I am on 326.
Well, that's not going to be the same as me.
I know. It is subchapter 5. That is where I is now, and it is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 10, 11, 12, 13,
like
14th 14th paragraph.
I can't count paragraphs. What's the line you're on?
She cackled freely at this.
Cackled freely at this?
You see it?
You said subchapter 5?
Yes, sir. So glad to have you, Daniel. All right, you good?
Gotcha. Yep, ready to go.
All right. She cackled freely at this, and Eddie suddenly realized Roland had at the same time made a joke and paid a compliment. The thought which had already occurred to Susanna now came to him. You gonna read, Eddie? Or you just
yeah.
Okay. This is how it.
Got it. Sorry, I'm catching up.
You're good.
This is how he was, and this is what he did. Part of it, anyway.
Gunslinger ye may be, but below your clothes, you're but another foolish man, she said, lapsing into low speech. Roland bowed again. Beauty has always made me foolish, mother. This time she positively cawed laughter. Oi shrank against Jake's leg. One of the albino twins rushed forward to catch the ancient as she rocked backward within her dusty, cracked shoes. She caught her balance on her own, however, and made an imperious shooing gesture with one hand. The albino retreated. Be ye on a quest, gunslinger? Her green eyes gleamed shrewdly at him. The puckered pocket of her mouth worked in and out. Aye, Roland said. We go in search of the Dark Tower. The others only looked puzzled. But the old woman recoiled and forked the sign of the evil eye. Not at them, Jake realized, but to the southeast, along the path of the beam. "I'm sorry to hear it," she cried. "For no one who's ever went in search of that black dog ever came back. So said my grandfather, and his grandfather before him. Not everyone." "Ah," the gunslinger said patiently, as if this explained everything. "Okay, bud." And Jake was coming to realize, to Roland, it did. "Aye," she agreed. "Black Dog Ka. Well, you'll do as you're called, and live along your path, and die when it comes to the clearing in the trees. Will ye break bread with us before you push on, gunslinger? You and your band of knights?" Roland bowed again. "It has been long and long since we have broken bread in company other than our own old mother. We cannot stay long, but yes, we'll eat your food with thanks and pleasure." The old woman turned to the others. She spoke in a cracked and ringing voice, yet it was the words she spoke, and not the tone in which they were spoken, that sent chills racing down Jake's back. "Behold ye, the return of the White! After evil ways and evil days, the White comes again. Be of good heart and holding up your heads, for ye have lived to see the wheel of Ka begin to turn once more." 6. The old woman, whose name was Aunt Talitha, led them through the town square into the church with the leaning spire. It was the church of the blood everlasting, according to the faded board on the run to riot lawn. Written over the words in green paint that had faded to a ghost was another message: "Death to Grays." She led them through the ruined church, hobbling rapidly along the center aisle past the splintered and overturned pews, down a short flight of stairs and into a kitchen so different from the ruin above that Susanna blinked in surprise. Here everything was neat as a pin. The wooden floor was very old, but it had been faithfully oiled and glowed with its own serene inner light. Glowed, not growed. The black cook stove took up one whole corner. It was immaculate, and the wood stacked in the brick alcove next to it looked both well chosen and well seasoned. Their party had been joined by 3 more senior citizens, 2 women and a man who limped along on a crutch and a wooden leg. 2 of the women went to the cupboards and began to make themselves busy. A third opened the belly of the stove and struck a long sulphur match to the wood already laid neatly within. A fourth opened another door and went down a short set of narrow steps into what looked like a cold pantry. Aunt Talitha, meanwhile, led the rest of them into a spacious entry at the rear of the church building. She waved her cane at 2 trestle tables which had been stored there under a clean but ragged drop cloth, and the 2 elderly albinos immediately went over and began to wrestle with one of them.
"Come on, Jake. Let's lend a hand."
"Nope," Aunt Talitha said briskly. "We may be old, but we don't need company to lend a hand. Not yet, youngster." "Leave them be."
"Old fools will rupture themselves."
But he followed the others, Eddie did, leaving the old men to their chosen table. Susanna gasped as Eddie lifted her from her chair and carried her through the back door. This wasn't a lawn, but a show place, with beds of flowers blazing like torches in the soft green grass. She saw some she recognized, marigolds and zinnias and phlox, but many others were strange to her. As she watched, a horsefly landed on a bright blue petal, which at once folded over it and rolled up tight.
"Wow!
Eddie said, staring around.
Busch Gardens!"
Sai said, This is the one place we keep the way it was in the old days, before the world moved on, and we keep it hidden from those who ride through, pubes, gray, harriers. They'd burn it if they knew, and kill us for keeping such a place. They hate anything nice, all of them. It's the one thing all those bastards have in common. The blind woman tugged his arm to shush him. This is a new
No
one.
writers these days.
The old man with the wooden leg said.
Not for a long time now. They keep closer in the city. Guess they'll find all they need to keep 'em right there.
The albino twins struggled out with the table. One of the old women followed them, urging them to hurry up and get the hell out of her way. She held a stoneware pitcher in each hand. Sit ye down, gunslinger, Aunt Talitha cried, sweeping her hand at the grass. Sit ye down, all. Susanna could smell 100 conflicting perfumes. They made her feel dazed and unreal, as if this was a dream she was having. She could hardly believe this strange little pocket of Eden, carefully hidden behind the crumbling facade of the dead town. Ah, see, it was facade.
Good job, buddy.
Another woman came out with a tray of glasses. They were mismatched but spotless, twinkling in the sun like fine crystal. She held the tray out first to Roland, then to Aunt Talitha, Eddie, Susanna, and Jake was at the last. As each took a glass, the first woman poured a dark golden liquid into it. Roland leaned over to Jake, who was sitting tailor fashion near an oval bed of bright green flowers with Oi at his side. He murmured, Drink only enough to be polite, Jake, or we'll be carrying you out of town. This is Graff, strong apple beer. Jake nodded. Talitha held up her glass, and when Roland followed suit, Eddie, Susanna, and Jake did the same.
What about the others?
Eddie whispered to Roland. They'll be served after the voluntary. Now be quiet. Will ye set us on with a word, gunslinger? Aunt Talitha asked. The gunslinger got to his feet, his glass upraised in his hand. He lowered his head as if in thought. The few remaining residents of River Crossing watched him respectfully, and Jake thought, a little fearfully. At last he raised his head again. Will you drink to the earth, and to the days which have passed upon it? He asked. His voice was hoarse, trembling with emotion. Will you drink to the fullness which was, and to the friends who have passed on? Will you drink to good company, well met? Will these things set us on, old mother? She was weeping, Jake saw, but her face broke into a smile of radiant happiness all the same. And for a moment she was almost young. Jake looked at her with wonder and sudden dawning happiness. For the first time since Eddie had hauled him through the door, he felt the shadow of the doorkeeper truly leave his heart. Aye, gunslinger, she said. Fair spoken. They'll set us on by the league, so they shall. Tilted her glass up and drank it at a draught. When the glass was empty, Roland emptied his own. Eddie and Susanna also drank, although less deeply. Jake tasted his own drink and was surprised to find he liked it. The brew was not bitter as he had expected, but both sweet and tart, like cider. He could feel the effects almost at once, however, and he put the glass carefully aside. Oi sniffed at it, then drew back and dropped his muzzle on Jake's ankle. Around them, the little company of old people, the last residents of River Crossing, were applauding. Most, like Aunt Talitha, were weeping openly. And now other glasses, not so fine but wholly serviceable, were passed around. The party began, and a fine party it was on that long summer's afternoon beneath the wide prairie sky. You get a drink. I need to be more airy with Aunt Talitha. I think.
He's a throwaway character. You're doing good.
All right. 7. Eddie thought the meal he ate that day was the best he had since the mythic birthday feasts of his childhood. When his mother had made it her business to serve everything he liked: meatloaf and roasted potatoes and corn on the cob and devil's food cake with vanilla ice cream on the side. The sheer variety of the edibles put before them, especially after the months they had spent eating nothing but lobster meat, deer meat, and a few bitter greens which Roland pronounced safe, undoubtedly had something to do with the pleasure he took in the food. But Eddie didn't think that was the sole answer. He noticed that the kid was packing it away by the plateful and feeding a chunk of something to the bumbler crouched at his feet every couple of minutes. And Jake hadn't been here a week yet. There were bowls of stew, chunks of buffalo meat floating in a rich brown gravy loaded with vegetables, platters of fresh biscuits, crocks of sweet white butter, and bowls of leaves that looked like spinach, but weren't exactly. Eddie had never been crazy about greens, but at the first taste of these, some deprived part of him awoke and cried for them. He ate well of everything, but his need for the green stuff approached greed, and he saw Susanna was also helping herself to them again and again. Among the 4 of them, the travelers emptied 3 bowls of the leaves. The dinner dishes were swept away by the old women and the albino twins. They returned with chunks of cake piled high on 2 thick white plates and a bowl of whipped cream. The cake gave off a sweetly fragrant smell that made Eddie feel as if he had died and gone to heaven. "Only buffalo cream," Aunt Talitha said dismissively. "No more cows. Last one croaked 30 years ago. Buffalo cream ain't no prize winner, but better than nothing, by Daisy." The cake turned out to be loaded with blueberries. Eddie thought it beat by a country mile any cake he'd ever had. He finished 3 pieces, leaned back, and belched ringingly before he could clap a hand over his mouth. He looked around guiltily. Mercy, the blind woman, cackled. "I heard that. Someone be thanking the cook, Auntie." "Aye," Aunt Talitha said, laughing herself. "So he do." The 2 women who had served the food were returning yet again. One carried a steaming jug. The other had a number of thick ceramic cups balanced precariously on her tray. Aunt Talitha was sitting at the head of the table, with Roland by her right hand. Now he leaned over and murmured something in her ear. She listened, her smile fading a little, then nodded. "Si, Bill, and Till," she said. "You 3 stay. We're going to have us a little palaver with this gunslinger and his friends, on account of they mean to move along this very afternoon. The rest of you take your coffee in the kitchen, and so cut down the babble. Mind you make your manners before you go." Bill and Till, the albino twins, remained sitting at the foot of the table. The others formed a line and moved slowly past the travelers. Each of them shook hands with Eddie and Susanna, then kissed Jake on the cheek. The boy accepted this with good grace, but Eddie could see he was both surprised and embarrassed. When they reached Roland, they knelt before him and touched the sandalwood butt of the revolver, which jutted from the holster he wore on his left hip. He put his hands on their shoulders and kissed their old brows. Mercy was the last. She flung her arms around Roland's waist and baptized his cheek with a wet, ringing kiss. "God's bless and keep ye, gunslinger. If only I could see ye." "Mind your manners, Mercy," Aunt Talitha said sharply, but Roland ignored her and bent over the blind woman. He took her hands gently but firmly in his own and raised them to his face. "See me with these, beauty," he said, and closed his eyes as her fingers, wrinkled and misshapen with arthritis, patted gently over his brow, his cheeks, his lips and chin. "Aye, gunslinger," she breathed, lifting the sightless sockets of her eyes to his faded blue ones. I see you very well. 'Tis a good face, but full of sadness and care. I fear for you and yours. Yet we are well met, are we not? He asked, and planted a gentle kiss on the smooth, worn skin of her forehead. Aye, so we are. So we are. Thank ye for your kiss, gunslinger. From my heart, I thank ye. Go on, Mercy, Aunt Talitha said in a gentler voice. Get your coffee. Mercy rose to her feet. The old man with the crutch and peg leg guided her hand to the waistband of his pants. She seized it and, with a final salute to Roland and his band, allowed him to lead her away. Eddie wiped his eyes, which were wet.
Blinded her.
Harriers. Did it with a branding iron, they did. Said it was because she was looking at him pert. 25 years agone that was. Drink your coffee now, all of you. It's nasty when it's hot, but it ain't nothing but road mud once it's cold. Eddie lifted the cup to his mouth and sipped experimentally. He wouldn't have gone so far as to call it road mud, but it wasn't exactly Blue Mountain Blend either. Susanna tasted hers and looked amazed. Why, this is chicory! I think I've lost Susanna's voice.
There's a lot of female voices going on. You're okay.
There is. Why, this is chicory. Talitha glanced at her. I know it not. Docky is all I know, and Docky's coffee. Coffee's all we've had since I've had the woman's curse. And that curse was lifted from me long, long ago. How old are you, ma'am? Jake asked suddenly. Aunt Talitha looked at him surprised, then cackled. In truth, lad, I disremember. I recall sitting in the same place and having a party to celebrate my 80. But there were over 50 people setting out on this lawn that day, and Mercy still had her eyes. Her own eyes dropped to the bumbler lying at Jake's feet. Boy didn't remove his muzzle from Jake's ankle, but he raised his gold-ringed eyes to gaze at her. A Billy Bumbler. By Daisy! It's been long and long since I've seen a bumbler in company with people. Seems they have lost the memory of the days when they walked with men. One of the albino twins bent down to pat Oi. Oi pulled away from him. You want to take the twins?
That is going to be rough. I'll be Bill. You want to be Till?
I
guess it doesn't matter.
Yeah, it goes back and forth.
Once they used to herd sheep.
Bill, or perhaps it was Till. Sorry. It says Bill or perhaps Till, said to Jake.
Did you know that, youngster?
Jake shook his head.
Do he talk?
Yeah, albino
Some
asked.
did in the old days.
Yes, he does. He looked down at the bumbler, who had returned his head to Jake's ankle as soon as the strange hand left his general area. Say your name, Oi. Oi only looked up at him. Oi! Jake urged, but Oi was silent. Jake looked at Aunt Talitha, and the twins mildly chagrined.
Chagrined, yeah.
Yeah, there we go. Chagrined? Is that what it is?
Yeah, it's like being embarrassed almost.
Okay. Well, he does, but I guess he only does it when he wants to. That boy doesn't look as if he belongs here, Aunt Talitha said to Roland. His clothes are strange, and his eyes are strange as well. He hasn't been here long. Roland smiled at Jake, and Jake smiled uncertainly back. In a month or two, no one will be able to see his strangeness. I wonder, so I do. And where does he come from? Far from here. Very far. She nodded. And when will he go back? Never, Jake said. This is my home now. God's pity you, then, she said, for the sun is going down on the world, and it's going down forever. At that, Susanna stirred uneasily. One hand went to her belly, as if her stomach was upset.
Suze, you all right?
She tried to smile, but it was a weak effort. Her normal confidence and self-possession seemed to have temporarily deserted her. Yes, of course. A goose walked over my grave, that's all. Aunt Talitha gave her a long, assessing look that seemed to make Susanna uncomfortable, and then smiled. A goose on my grave! Ha! I haven't heard that one in a donkey's years. My dad used to say it all the time. Susanna smiled at Eddie, a stronger smile this time. And anyway, whatever it was, it's gone now. I'm fine. What do you know about the city? The lands between here and there, Roland asked, picking up his coffee cup and sipping. Are there harriers? Who are these others? These grays and pubes? Aunt Talitha sighed deeply. This is gonna be I think this is the long chapter.
They kind of pump back and forth too, so
Mm-hmm.
I'll help out as much as I can.
All right. 8. Ye'd hear much, gunslinger, and we know but little. One thing I do know is this. The city is an evil place, especially for this youngster. Any youngster. Is there any way you can steer around it as you go your course? Roland looked up and observed the now familiar shape of the clouds as they followed along the path of the beam. In this wide, plain sky, that shape, like a river in the sky, was impossible to miss. Perhaps, said at last, but his voice was oddly reluctant. I suppose we could skirt around Ludd to the southwest and pick up the beam on the far side. It's the beam ye follow, she said. Aye, I thought so. Eddie found his own consideration of the city colored by the steadily strengthening hope that when and if they got there, they would find help, abandoned goodies which would aid them in their quest, or maybe even some people who could tell them a little more about the Dark Tower and what they were supposed to do when they got there. The ones called the Greys, for instance. They sounded like the sort of wise old elves that he kept imagining. The drums were creepy, true enough, reminding him of 100 low-budget jungle epics, mostly watched on TV with Henry by his side and a bowl of popcorn between them. Were the fabulous lost cities the explorers had come looking for were in ruins, and the natives had degenerated into tribes of bloodthirsty cannibals. But Eddie found it impossible to believe something like that could have happened in a city that looked, at least from a distance, so much like New York. If there were not wise old elves or abandoned goodies, there surely would be books, at least. He had listened to Roland talk about how rare paper was here, but every city Eddie had ever been in was absolutely drowning in books. They might even find some working transportation. The equivalent of a Land Rover would be nice. That was probably just a silly dream. But when you had thousands of miles of unknown territory to cover, a few silly dreams were undoubtedly in order, if only to keep your spirits up. And weren't those things at least possible, damn it? He opened his mouth to say some of these things, but Jake spoke before he could. I don't think we can go around, he said, then blushed a little when they all turned to look at him. Boy shifted at his feet. No? And why do you think that? Pray tell. Do you know about trains? There was a long silence. Bill and Till exchanged an uneasy glance. Aunt Talitha only looked at Jake steadily. Jake did not drop his eyes. I heard of one. Mayhap even saw it over there. He pointed in the direction of the Send. Long ago, when I was but a child and the world hadn't moved on, or at least not as far as it has now, and it's Blaine ye speak of, boy. Is it? Jake's eyes flashed in surprise and recognition. Yes, Blaine. Roland was studying Jake closely. And how would ye know of Blaine the Mono? Mono? Jake looked blank. Aye, so it was called. How would you know of that old lay? Jake looked helplessly at Roland, then back at Aunt Talitha. I don't know how I know.
And that's the truth.
Eddie thought suddenly.
But it's not all the truth. He knows more than he wants to tell here, and I think he's scared.
This is our business, I think, Roland said in a dry, brisk administrator's voice. You must let us work it out for ourselves, old mother. Aye, agreed quickly. You'll keep your... sorry. Ooh, that went way off course.
Ooh.
You'll keep your own counsel. Best that such as us not know. What of the city? What do you know of Lud? Little now, but what we know you shall hear. And she poured herself another cup of coffee. 9. It was the twins, Bill and Till, who actually did most of the talking. One taking up the tale smoothly whenever the other left off. Every now and then, Aunt Talitha would add something or correct something, and the twins would wait respectively until they were sure she was done. Cy didn't speak at all, merely sat with his untouched coffee in front of him, plucking at the pieces of straw which bristled up from the wide brim of his sombrero. They knew little, indeed, Roland realized quickly, even about the history of their own town, nor did this surprise him. In these latter days, memories faded rapidly, and all but the most recent past seemed not to exist. But what they did know was disturbing. Roland was not surprised by this either. In the days of their great-great-grandparents, river crossing had been much the town Susanna had imagined. A trade stop at the great road, modestly prosperous. A place where goods were sometimes sold but more often exchanged. It had been at least nominally part of River Barony, although even then such things as baronies and estates of land had been passing. There had been buffalo hunters in those days. Although the trade had been dying out, the herds were small and badly mutated. The meat of these mutant beasts was not poison, but it had been rank and bitter. Yet, river crossing, located between a place they simply called the Landing and the village of Jimtown, had been a place of some note. It was on the great road and only 6 days' travel from the city by land and 3 by barge. Unless the river were low. Sorry. How are you doing, the twins?
That's pretty good.
Unless the river were low, one of the twins said. Then it took longer, and my granda said there was times when there was barges grounded all the way upriver to Tom's Neck. The old people knew nothing of the city's original residents, force, or the technologies they had used to build the towers and turrets. These were the great old ones, and their history had been lost in the furthest reaches of the past, even when Aunt Talitha's great-great-grandfather had been a boy.
The buildings are still standing. I wonder if the machines the great golden oldies used to build them still run.
Mayhap, one of the twins said. If so, young fella, there ain't be airy man or woman that lives there now who'd still know how to run 'em. Or so I believe, so I do. His brother said.
I doubt the old ways are entirely lost to the grays and pubes even now.
He looked at Eddie.
Our Da said there was once electric candles in the city. There are those who say they might still burn. Imagine that.
Eddie replied wonderingly, and Susanna pinched his leg hard under the table. Yes, the other twin said. He spoke seriously, unaware of Eddie's sarcasm. You pushed a button and they came on, bright, heatless candles with airy wicks or reservoirs for oil. And I've heard it said that once, in the old days, the outlaw prince actually flew up into the sky in a mechanical bird, but one of his wings broke. And he died in a great fall, like Icarus. Susanna's mouth dropped open. You know the story of Icarus? Aye, lady. Said, clearly surprised she should find this strange. He of beeswax wings. Children's stories, both of them, Antalathus said with a sniff. I know the story of the endless lights is true, for I saw them with my own eyes when I was but a green girl, and they may still glow from time to time, aye. There are those I trust who say they've seen them on clear nights, although it's been long years since I have myself. But no man ever flew, not even the great old ones. Nonetheless, there were strange machines in the city, built to do peculiar and sometimes dangerous things. Many of them might still run, but the elderly twins reckoned that none now in the city knew how to start them up, for they hadn't been heard in years.
Maybe that could change, though.
Eddie thought. His eyes were gleaming.
If, that is, an enterprising, travel minded young man with a little knowledge about strange machinery and endless lights came along. It could be just a matter of finding the on switches. I mean, it really could be that simple. Or maybe they just blew a bunch of fuses. Think of that. Friends and neighbors, just replace half a dozen 400-amp buses and light the whole place up like Reno Saturday night.
Susanna elbowed him and asked in a low voice, What was so funny? Eddie shook his head and put a finger to his lips, earning an irritated look from the love of his life. The albinos, meanwhile, were continuing their story, handing its thread back and forth with the unconscious ease which probably nothing but lifetime twinship can provide. 4 or 5 generations ago, they said, the city had still been quite heavily populated and reasonably civilized. Words, hello. It's split on
I
my...
like civilized.
Civilized, yes. Okay. I'm going to need to wear my glasses. It's split right at civvy and lised. I was like, oh, shit. I don't know if is it that way for you, too?
Mine's a civ and alized.
Okay. Although the residents drove wagons and buckboards along the wide boulevards of great old ones had constructed for their fabulous horseless vehicles, the city dwellers were artisans, and what the twins called manufactories, and trade both on the river and over it had been brisk. Over it? Roland asked. The bridge over the Seine still stands, Aunt Talitha said. Or did 20 years ago.
Aye, old Bill Muffin and his boys saw it not 10 years gone.
Cy agreed, making his first contribution to the conversation. What sort of bridge? The gunslinger asked. A great thing of steel cables, one of the twins said. It stands in the sky like the web of some great spider. He added shyly, I should like to see it again before I die. Which voice is this one? Probably fallen in by now. And good riddance, devil's work. He turned to the twins. Tell 'em what's happened since, and why the city's so dangerous now, apart from any haunts that may den there, that is, and I'll warrant there's a power of 'em. These folks want to get on, and the sun's on the wester. 10. The rest of the story was but another version of a tale Roland of Gilead had heard many times, and had, in some measure, lived through himself. It was fragmentary and incomplete, undoubtedly shot through with myth and misinformation, its linear progress distorted by the odd changes, both temporal and directional, which were now taking place in the world, and it could be summed up in a single compound sentence. Once there was a world we knew, but that world has moved on. These old people of river crossing knew of Gilead no more than Roland knew of the river barony, and the name of John Farson, the man who had brought ruin and anarchy in Roland's land, meant nothing to them. But all stories of the old world's passing were similar, too similar, Roland thought, to be a coincidence. A great civil war, perhaps in Garland, perhaps in a more distant land called Portla, had erupted perhaps even 400 years ago. Its ripples had spread slowly outward, pushing anarchy and dissension ahead of them. Few, if any, kingdoms had been able to stand against those slow waves, and anarchy had come to this part of the world as surely as night follows sunset. At one time, whole armies had been on the roads, sometimes in advance, sometimes in retreat, always confused and without long-term goals. As time passed, they crumbled into smaller groups, and these degenerated into roving bands of harriers. Trade faltered, then broke down entirely. Travel went from a matter of inconvenience to one of danger. In the end, it became almost impossible. Communication with the city thinned steadily, and had all but ceased 120 years ago. Like 100 other towns Roland had ridden through, first with Cuthbert and the other gunslingers cast out of Gilead, then alone, in pursuit of the men in black. River crossing had been cut off and thrown on its own resources. At this point, Cy roused himself, and his voice captured the travelers at once. He spoke in the hoarse, cadenced tones of a lifelong teller of tales, one of those divine fools born to merge memory and mendacity into dreams as airily gorgeous as cobwebs strung with the drops of dew. You want to take this, or you want me to take this?
Yeah, I'm fine.
Okay.
We last sent tribute to the barony castle in the time of my great-granddad. 26 men went with the wagon of hides. There was no hard corn anymore by then, of course, and it was the best they could do. It was a long and dangerous journey of almost 80 wheels, and 6 died on the way. Half fell to the harriers bound for the war in the city. The other half died either of disease or devil grass. When they finally arrived, they found the castle deserted but for the rooks and blackbirds. The walls had been broken, weeds overgrew the court estate. There had been a slaughter on the fields to the west. They were white with bones and red with rusty armor. So my granddad said, and the voices of demons cried out like the cast of wind from the jawbones of those who'd fallen there. The village beyond the castle had been burned to the ground, and 1,000 or more skulls were posted along the walls of that keep. Our folk left their bounty of hides without the shattered Barbican gate, for none would venture inside the place of ghosts and moaning voices, and began the homeward way again. 10 more fell on that journey, so the 26 who left, only 10 returned. My great-granddad, one of them, but he picked up a ringworm on his neck and bosom that never left until the day he died. It was the radiation sickness, or so they said. After that gunslinger, none left for town. We were on our own.
They grew. As this is still you, or okay?
This is narrator.
They grew used to the depredations of the harriers. Syke continued in his cracked but melodious voice. Watches were posted. When bands of riders were seen approaching, almost always moving southeast along the Great Road and the path of the Beam, going to the war which raged endlessly in Lud, the townspeople hid in a large shelter they had dug beneath the church. Casual damages to the town were not repaired, lest they make those roving bands curious. Most were beyond curiosity. They only rode through at a gallop. Bows or battle axes slung over their shoulders, bound for the killing zones. What war is it you speak of?
Yes. And what about that drumming sound?
The twins again exchanged a quick, almost superstitious glance.
We know not of the god drums. Ere were to watch the war of the city now.
The war had originally been the harriers and outlaws against a loose confederation of artisans and manufactories who lived in the city. The residents had decided to fight instead of allowing the harriers to loot them, burn their shops, and then turn the survivors out into the big empty, where they would almost certainly die. And for some years they had successfully defended Lud against the vicious but badly organized groups of raiders which tried to storm across the bridge or invade by boat and barge.
Got it. The city folk used the old weapons. And though their numbers were small, the Harriers could not stand against such things with their bows and maces and battle axes. Do you mean the city people use guns?
One of the albinos nodded.
Aye, guns, but not just guns. There were things that hurled the firebanks over a mile or more. Explosions like dynamite. Only more powerful, the outlaws, who are now the Greys, as you must ken, could do nothing but lay siege beyond the river, and that's what they did.
Lud became, in effect, the last fortress refuge of the latter world. The brightest and most able traveled there from the surrounding countryside by ones and twos. When it came to intelligence tests, sneaking through the tangled encampments and front lines of the besiegers was the newcomers' final exam. Most came unarmed across the no man's land of the bridge, and those who made it that far were let through. Some were found wanting and sent packing again, of course, but those who had a trade or a skill, or brains enough to learn one, were allowed to stay. Farming skills were particularly prized, according to the stories. Every large park in Lud had been turned into a vegetable garden. With the countryside cut off, it was grow food in the city or starve amid the glass towers and metal alleys. The great old ones were gone. Their machines were a mystery, and the silent wonders which remained were inedible. Little by little, the character of the war began to change. The balance of power had shifted to the besieging Greys, so called because they were, on average, much older than the city dwellers. Those latter were also growing older, of course. They were still known as pubes, but in most cases their puberty was long behind them, and they eventually either forgot how the old weapons worked or used them up. Hi, Stephen King. You're welcome for reading your book. I appreciate it as well. Probably both, Roland grunted. Some 90 years ago, within the lifetimes of Sai and Aunt Talitha, a final band of outlaws had appeared, one so large that the outriders had gone galloping through river crossing at dawn, and the drogues did not pass until almost sundown. It was the last army these parts had ever seen, and it was led by a warrior prince named David Quick, the same fellow who supposedly later fell to his death from the sky. He had organized the raggle-taggle remnants of the outlaw bands which still hung about the city, killing anyone who showed opposition to his plans. Quick's army of Greys used neither boat nor bridge to attempt entry into the city, but instead built a pontoon bridge 12 miles below it and attacked on the flank. Since then, the war has guttered like a chimney fire. We hear reports every now and then from someone who has managed to leave, aye? So we do. These come a little more often now, for the bridge, they say, is an undefended, and I think the fire's almost out. Within the city, the pubes and Greys squabble over the remaining spoils. Only I reckon that the descendants of the harriers who followed Quick over the pontoon bridge are the real pubes now, although they are still called Greys. The descendants of the original city dwellers must now be almost as old as we are, although there are still some youngers who go to be among them, drawn by the old stories and the lure of the knowledge which may still remain there. These two sides still keep up their old enmity, Gunslinger, and both would desire this young man you call Eddie. If the dark-skinned woman is fertile, they would not kill her, even though her legs are short-ended. They would keep her to bear children, for children are fewer now. And although the old sicknesses are passing, some are still born strange. At this, Susanna stirred, seemed about to say something, then only drank the last of her coffee and settled back into her former listening position. But if they would desire the young man and woman Gunslinger, I think they would lust for the boy. Jake bent and began to stroke Oi's fur again. Roland saw his face and knew what he was thinking. It was the passage under the mountains all over again. Just another version of the slow mutants. You'd they'd just as soon kill. For you are a gunslinger, a man out of his own time and place, neither fish nor fowl, and no use to either side. But a boy can be taken, used, schooled to remember some things, and to forget all the others. They've all forgotten whatever it was they had to fight about in the first place. The world has moved on since then. Now they just fight to the sound of them awful drum beats. Some few still young, most of them old enough for the rocking chair, like us here. All of them stupid grots, who only live to kill and kill to live. Now that you've heard us old cullies to the end, are ye sure it would not be best to go around and leave them to their business? Before Roland could reply, Jake spoke up in a clear, firm voice. Tell what you know about Blaine the Mono. Tell about Blaine and Engineer Bob. 11.
Engineer who?
Eddie asked, but Jake only went on looking at the old people.
Should that sigh?
You want me to catch it?
Track lies over yonder.
Well, there you go. Sai answered at last after the long pause. He pointed toward the river.
Only one track left, set high in a column of man-made stone, just as the old ones used to make their streets and walls.
A monorail! Blaine the monorail! Blaine is a pain. Roland glanced at him but said nothing.
Does this train run now?
Eddie asked Sai. Sai shook his head slowly. His face was troubled and uneasy.
No, young sir. But in my lifetime in Aunties it did. When we were still green and the war of the city still went forward briskly. The fuck is that? We'd hear it before we saw it. A low humming noise. A sound. Like you sometimes hear when a bad summer storm's on the way. One that's full of lightning.
Aye. Talitha's face was lost in dreaming.
So sigh.
Yeah.
Then it'd come Blaine the Mono, twinkling in the sun with a nose like one of the bullets out of your revolver, gunslinger. Maybe 2 wheels long. I know that sounds like it could be, and maybe it wasn't. We were green, you must remember, and that makes the difference. But I still think it was, for when it came, it seemed to run along the whole horizon fast and low, and gone before you could even see it proper. Sometimes on days when the weather were foul and the air low, it'd shriek like a harpy as it came out of the west. Sometimes it'd come in the night with long white light spread out before it, and that shriek would wake all of us up. If it were the trumpet they say will raise the dead from the graves at the end of the world, so it was.
Tell 'em about the bang, Si, Billertill said in a voice which trembled with awe. Tell 'em about the godless bang that always came after.
I was just getting to that. After it passed by, there would be quiet a few seconds. Sometimes as long as a minute, maybe.
Wait. I picture this, and he's like this. Like talking with his hands. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
This very like old guy in a junkyard kind of vibes here.
Yeah.
And then there'd come an explosion that rattled the boards and knocked cups off the shelves and sometimes even broke the glass window and the panes. But never did anyone see area flash nor fire. And it was an explosion in the world of spirits.
Eddie tapped Susanna on the shoulder, and when she turned to him, he mouthed 2 words.
Sonic boom.
It was nuts. No train he had ever heard of traveled faster than the speed of sound, but it was also the only thing that made sense. She nodded and turned back to Si.
The only one of the machines of the great old ones made I've ever seen running with my own eyes. And if it weren't for the devil's work, there would be no devil. The last time I saw it was the spring I married Mercy. That must have been 60 years ago.
70? And this train went into the city. From back the way we came, from the west, from the forest. Aye, a new voice said unexpectedly. But there was another, one that went out from the city, and mayhap that one still runs. 12. They turned. Mercy stood by a bed of flowers between the back of the church and the table where they sat. She was walking slowly toward the sound of their voices. You want to pick up Mercy on this next part? Or no, I'll pick it up. Walking slowly toward the sound of their voices with her hands spread out before her. Si got clumsily to his feet, hurried to her as best as he could, and took her hand. She slipped an arm about his waist, and they stood there looking like the world's oldest wedding couple. Si.
Auntie told you to take your coffee inside.
Finished my coffee long ago. It's a bitter brew. I hate it. Besides, I wanted to hear the palaver. He raised a trembling finger and pointed it in Roland's direction. I wanted to hear his voice. It's fair and light, so it is.
Try your pardon, Auntie,
Si said, looking at the ancient woman with a little fearfully.
She was never one to mind, and the years have made her no better.
Aunt Talitha glanced at Roland. He nodded, almost imperceptibly. Let her come forward and join us. Si led her over to the table, scolding all the while. Mercy only looked over his shoulder with her sightless eyes, her mouth set in an intractable line. When Si had gotten her seated, Aunt Talitha leaned forward on her forearms and said, Now, do you have something to say, old Sister Si, or were you just beating your gums? I hear what I hear. My ears are as sharp as they ever were, Talitha. Sharper! Roland's hand dropped to his belt for a moment. When he brought it back to the table, he was holding a cartridge in his fingers. He tossed it to Susanna, who caught it. Do you, Si? He asked. Well enough, he said, turning in his direction. To know that you just threw something. To your woman, I think. The one with the brown skin. Something small. What was it, gunslinger? A biscuit? Close enough, he said, smiling. Do you hear as well as you hear as well as you say? Now tell us what you meant. Shit. There is another mono, he said. Unless 'tis the same one, but running a different course. Either way, a different course was run by some mono. Until 77 or 80 years ago, anyways. I used to hear it leaving the city and going out into the wastelands beyond. Dung heap, one of the albino twins ejaculated. Nothing goes to the wastelands, nothing can live there. She turned her face to him. Is a train alive? Tell Tedberry? Does a machine fall sick with sores and puking?
Well,
And he thought of saying.
there was this bear.
He thought it over a little while more and decided it might be better to keep his silence. We would have
heard it.
It was like the twins answering at the same time. The other twin was insisting hotly.
Noise like the one Sai always tells of.
This one didn't make no bang, he admitted. But I heard that other sound, that humming noise like the one you hear sometimes after lightning is struck somewhere close. When the wind was strong blowing out from the city, I heard it. She thrust out her chin and added, I did hear the bang once, too, from far, far out. The night Big Charlie Wind came and almost blew the steeple off the church. Must have been 200 wheels from here. Maybe 250.
Oh, dink! You've been chewing the weed.
I'll chew on you, Bill Tudbury, if you don't shut up your honkin'. You've no business saying bulding to a lady, either. Why...
Stop it, Mercy.
Cy hissed, but Eddie was barely listening to this exchange of rural pleasantries. What the blind woman had said made sense to him. Of course, there would be no sonic boom, not from a train which started its run in Lud. He couldn't remember exactly what the speed of sound was, but he thought it was somewhere in the neighborhood of 650 miles an hour. A train starting from a dead stop would take some time getting up to that speed, and by the time it reached it, it would be out of earshot, unless the listening conditions happened to be just right, as Mercy claimed they had been on the night when the Big Charlie Wind, whatever that was, had come. And there were possibilities here. Blaine the Mono was no Land Rover, but maybe. You haven't heard the sound of this other train for 7 or 8 years, Si? Are you sure it wasn't much longer? Could have been, couldn't have been. But the last time was the year old Bill Muffin took old Bloodsick. Poor Bill. That's almost 10 year gone, Aunt Talitha said, and her voice was queerly gentle. Shit, I said that wrong then.
Why did you never say you heard such a thing?
Cy asked and looked at the gunslinger.
Can't believe everything she says, Lord. Always longing to be in the middle of the stage is my mercy.
Why, you old slumgullion, he cried and slapped his arm. I didn't say because I didn't want to overtop the story you're so proud of, but now that it matters what I heard, I'm bound to tell. I believe you, Si, but are you sure you haven't heard the sounds of the mono since then? Nay, not since then. I imagine it's finally reached the end of its path. I wonder. Indeed, I wonder very much. He looked down at the table, brooding, suddenly far away from all of them. Choo, choo, Jake thought, and shivered. 13. Half an hour later, they were in the town square again. Susanna in her wheelchair, Jake adjusting the straps of his pack while Oi sat at his heel, watching him attentively. Only the town elders had attended the dinner party in the Little Eden behind the Church of the Blood Everlasting, it seemed, because when they returned to the square, Another dozen people were waiting. They glanced at Susanna and looked a bit longer at Jake, his youth apparently more interesting to them than her dark skin. But it was clearly Roland they had come to see. Their wondering eyes. Okay. Their wondering eyes were full of ancient awe. He's a living remnant of a past they only know from stories, Susanna thought. They look at him the way religious people would look at one of the saints, Peter or Paul or Matthew. If he decided to drop by the Saturday night bean supper and tell them stories of how it was traipsing around the Sea of Galilee with Jesus the carpenter. The ritual which had ended the meal was now repeated, only this time everyone left in River Crossing participated. They shuffled forward in a line, shaking hands with Eddie and Susanna, kissing Jake on the cheek or forehead, then kneeling in front of Roland for his touch and his blessing. Mercy threw her arms about him and pressed her blind face against his stomach. Roland hugged her back and thanked her for her news. Will ye not stay the night with us, gunslinger? Sunset comes on apace, and it's been long since you and yours spent the night beneath the roof, I'll warrant. It has been. But it's best we go on. Thank ye, Si. Will ye come again if ye may, gunslinger? Yes, Roland said, but Eddie did not need to look into his strange friend's face to know the chances were small. If we can. Aye. She hugged him a final time, then passed on with her hand resting on Si's sunburned shoulder. Fare ye well. Aunt Talitha came last. When she began to kneel, Roland caught her by the shoulders. No, Si, you shall not do. Before Eddie's amazed eyes, Roland knelt before her, the dust of the town square. Will you bless me, old mother? Will you bless all of us as we go on our course? Aye, she said. There was no surprise in her voice, no tears in her eyes, but her voice throbbed with deep feeling all the same. I see your heart is true, gunslinger, and that you hold the old ways of your kind. Aye, you hold them very well. I bless you and yours, and will pray that no harm will come to you. Now take this, if you will. No noise. I'll have to fix it later.
No. I have this. It turned on. This works. I have to put that.
Jackson. Other side.
Alright. So, you think this will work?
Go away.
Thanks for the input.
Ugh, where was I at? Oh, if you will. She reached into the bodice of her faded dress and removed a silver cross at the end of a fine linked silver chain. She took it off. Just a second. Be right back. Sneak, can you catch up? I gotta go to the bathroom.
Now it was Roland's turn to be surprised. Are you sure? I did not come to take what belongs to you and yours, old mother. I'm sure as can be. I've worn this day and night for over 100 years, gunslinger. Now you shall wear it and lay it at the foot of the dark tower, and speak the name of Talitha Unwin at the far end of the earth. She slipped the chain over his head. The cross dropped into the open neck of his deerskin shirt, as if it belonged there. Go now. We have broken bread and we have held palaver. We have your blessing and you have ours. Go your course in safety. Stand and be true. Her voice trembled, and broke on the last word. Roland rose to his feet, then bowed and tapped his throat 3 times. Thank you, Sai. She bowed back but did not speak. Now there were tears coursing down her cheeks. Ready? Roland asked. Eddie nodded. He did not trust himself to speak. All right, Roland said, let's go. They walked down what remained of the town's high street, Jake pushing Shazana's wheelchair. As they passed the last building, Trade and Change, the faded sign read. He looked back. The old people were still gathered around the stone marker, a forlorn cluster of humanity in the middle of the wide, empty plain. Jake raised his hand. Up to this point, he had managed to hold himself in. But when several of the old folks, Cy, Bill, and Till among them, raised their own hands in return, Jake burst into tears himself. Eddie put an arm around his shoulder. Just keep walking, sport, he said in an uneasy voice. That's the only way to do it.
They're so old. How can we just leave them like this? It's not right.
It's Ka.
Is it? Well, Ka sucks.
Yeah, hard, Eddie agreed, but he kept walking. So did Jake, and he didn't look back again. He was afraid they would still be there, standing at the center of their forgotten town, watching until Roland and his friends were out of view. And he would have been right.
Hold on. Oh, shit. It's been like 2 hours and that was my first break. Do you mind if I take a little bit? Just take another break? Like an actual stretching break this time? All right.
Yeah.
I'm going to switch it over. Huh?
I've got to be done for the night. So if you want to just stop at 14.
Okay. Yeah, we can
That's
pick
a
it
good
up.
stopping point. Yeah.
Yeah. All right, everybody, you have a great night. We will get the other half of this uploaded, but join us Friday nights for the book club over on _Sneak Thieves channel. We do a book club with the rest of the community. And it's so far has been a lot of fun. Thank you, Sneak, for jumping in and helping me read. It's been a blast. Always has. So much fun.
Yeah.
All right. Good night, everybody. Y'all have a good night.
Good night.